Okay, so this week we're going to take a look at these two pairings that are somewhat related. However, they're not as related, they're not as closely related as we usually think. Um, so we're going to take a look at the Hebrew scriptures, and these later on did influence the Christian writings, but they are rather different. I'm just kind of pairing them together for expediency in the course. So, the first thing is when you read some of these selections from the Hebrew scriptures, um, is to point out that they literally do mean the writings of the Hebrew people. That's what scriptures means. That's entirely it. So, it has different connotations, but it's the writings of the Hebrew people. When you use the word testament, that is a Christian term, which is testimony, right? So Christians will use the Hebrew scriptures and they will call them the Old Testament. And then the new writings, of course, are called the New Testament. But this is just strictly a Christian terminology, testament. So in these scriptures, we will see that there's many stories, and the stories are following a lot of the heroic journeys that we have been reading up to this point, which is, to be expected. All of these people are living around the same physical area. And of course, as these stories are building up, they get passed along, especially when writing is in effect. And so they share a lot of commonalities. What we see is while there are some central heroes, there is Abraham, there is Moses. Overall, there's not one central hero. It is more as the culture is the hero of these stories. So consider that when you're reading some of the excerpts. Also, the same as with anything that we have been reading so far, while some things can be shown to be accurate historically, others are not. So you can't read the Hebrew scriptures as history per se. We do know that the Euphrates River floods, and was that what helped bring along the flood story? And we certainly remember that we saw the flood story in Gilgamesh. Interestingly enough, the story of Jews being enslaved by Egyptians, of which there is no evidence whatsoever. So it's a very interesting story, but it has not been able to be corroborated by any historians. And we are talking about historians who are actually invested in trying to collaborate it. Anyway, you will see if you read into the Hebrew scriptures in depth, you will see that it does unfold like a Greek tragedy. There is a lot of murder, revenge, a phenomenal amount of sex. I bet you didn't realize that. And there's also genocide. There's a lot of main themes throughout, and we don't see human nature as very positive. While there are positive points within it, it does show human nature as to be somewhat venomous. Is this necessarily different from other things that we have read? I'm not really sure. I think it reflects a lot on how humans can be by nature, but we also have many thousands of years in the interim, and we have those thousands of years of progressive thought. So when we look back at these ancient people, I think we have to look at it from, how do we judge them? We judge them from the time period that they were living in, or not. Some people say, no, you should always know better. You should always know that you shouldn't enslave people, etc., and things like that. I think it's unrealistic. But in any event, the Hebrew scriptures are not meant as a proselytizing allegory or anything like that. So the Hebrews were simply writing to tell their own stories to their own tribe, their own people, and it was not to bring anybody into the fold, which would be contrasted with Christianity, which began proselytizing and still continues to this day. So there's a difference between the two cultures. And again, you could see here, as what I was saying earlier about judgment, it reflects the culture of the time. It doesn't necessarily give us answers, but it should be involving people in something that is maybe not answerable. What does it mean to be human on this planet? So what else do we have here? Just a few brief words on some of the scriptures that you will be reading. The first thing is when we have the reflection within the Hebrew scriptures of humans as maybe not in their best light. It's not that you see a just world, but an accurate world. And then how do you reconcile that with a just God? And the answers are not in the scriptures, because I think people had a lot of difficulty with that. I guess I should interject there that the Hebrews were one of the first to talk about their God as being the one, but it's not monotheistic. I think a lot of people feel that it's monotheistic, but the scriptures absolutely mention other gods, but they were not considered true gods, right? But that other people can worship the other gods. It is the Hebrew people need to worship this God and no other. So we also see, what you'll be reading is going to be the creation stories. Some probably were somewhat familiar with them. There are two versions, and they are in your reading. So one of them is a paired system telling, okay, there was day, there was night, there was sea, there was air. And then the second one is more of an oral folk tradition, and it's not as neatly planned out. They have humans, well, one man, right, who's on earth, and he's told to till the land. But then, that came actually before there was demonstrated agriculture. You see a lot of different contradictions. We don't have time to get into it. But there are two different creation stories that have been put together for whatever reason. They've compiled these two different creation stories together. And I wanted to then get into the early Christian history, so I'm kind of going to skip ahead. We have here, growing from that Hebrew tradition, then we have the idea of Jesus, who is going to be a Messiah. And then this is obviously the connection that we have between the Hebrew scriptures and early Christian history. We do not have the historical Jesus. The question of that is not settled. All of the Gospels were written at least 40 to 150 years after the death of Jesus. We don't have any eyewitness accounts, so that's really something that's still up in the air. During that first century, what we call the first century now, there were a lot of competing factions within the Jewish tradition. So all of them were saying that they were the one, right? Which starts maybe one of these movements, right? If you have the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and Yeshua, maybe, and Jesus. There's going to be a lot of great diversity within that Christian movement once it actually gets started. And then Paul is the one who is well known to be the greatest missionary of the Christian religion. And he was executed in the year 62. It did grow slowly. Of course, we know that they were persecuted by the Romans. And then what happens? Emperor Constantine says Christians have rights. And then we have the Nicene Creed, the establishment of orthodoxy, which is kind of interesting. Then this orthodoxy is like, this is the truth. Then you have the next emperor who restores paganism. Then you have the next emperor says, no, we're going back to Christianity. And so then that becomes the Roman religion. And since then, we also know there's many splits and factions. The first big one was between the Romans and Greeks. And then, of course, we have Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, etc., which is not early Christian history. When we look at the New Testament and some of the excerpts that we have in our book for the New Testament, we have the section, there's 5 sections within the New Testament. First, we have the Gospels. They're Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they often tell different stories. They cannot be read side by side because they're going to, some of them will tell the similar things. Others will tell different areas. There's often people who think that they know the story of the Gospels, but actually they're telling somewhat disparate stories. Some of them can't be reconciled. So there are 4 distinct different Gospels and 4 distinct different stories. So these are called the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, apocryphal, comes later. And John is one of the most extreme parts of the Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're the earliest tradition, and John absolutely took them for earlier materials, and he came up with more extreme thoughts. We have Mark, Christ is a man. Matthew and Luke, he was a demigod, and John insists that he was God himself. So as you can see within the 4 different Gospels, there's going to be a lot of disparity. The other sections of the New Testament include the Acts of the Apostles, right? These are what the apostles did, the formation of the church. You have the epistles of Paul, right? So he was the greatest missionary. Those are the letters of Paul, the letters that he was writing to spread the religion. And then you have other epistles. That's everybody else but Paul, all stuck together. And then the last section is prophecy or revelation. And that is a really interesting section to read because it is really out there. It's just really interesting to read the story as it is being told. Highly imaginative and very supernatural. I'm sure you've heard of some of them, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, etc. And we have Augustine, Saint Augustine, right? He says, in order for you to understand all of this, you need to read the Bible on 4 levels, which is the literal, right, which is the actual historical facts of what's going on. There is the allegorical, and we already know what allegory is. There is the moral actions. What are the ethical obligations? And you would have to look at, what is the definition of morality within the New Testament, and you can also contrast that with what is morality in the Hebrew Scriptures, because they don't fit together. And then you have the anagogical. What is the connection? How do you connect the past to the future? How do you connect all of this, the mystical, the spiritual, beyond the literal, all of that together? So if the literal teaches you history, the allegorical, what you should believe, the morals, what you should do, the anagogical, which is where are you going? So that's what St. Augustine says. That's how you read it. It was primarily written in Greek. Educated people wrote it. The New Testament is. And there's good evidence, however, that some of it existed in Hebrew and also Aramaic. So that is a brief overview of both of these 2 very large amounts of writing that we are covering this week. Thanks.